Hello. Nice to see you all back in the cold Melbourne winter, dragging yourselves out of bed early. It's bracing. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Dr. Alicia Coram, and I'll be giving 3 lectures in History of Ideas this year. This week's lecture is on Enlightenment, Ideas and Society. Next week I'll be picking up on a particularly important idea in the Enlightenment, ideas about freedom and liberty and natural rights, and talking about them in the context of the French Revolution. The following week I'll be talking about Romanticism, which in many ways was a reaction to some of the ideas of the Enlightenment. So that's what we'll be doing. A couple of announcements. One, I get very twitchy if people talk in lectures. So please don't talk. I know in the back row you feel like people can't hear you, but the lecturers can hear you and it's very distracting. You should all know that the essay questions, your second essay questions, are now available on TCOL. So go ahead and have a look at those, download the reading packs, and you'll be talking with your tutors about them in tutorials over the coming weeks. One of the questions is about Martin Luther and to what extent, or whether we can call Luther a revolutionary. The other question is, to what extent was the French Revolution an outcome of Enlightenment ideas? So if that one is of interest, then these couple of lectures will have something that might be of interest to you that you could use in your essays. Today's lectures, and just to remind you, if you ever get lost in History of Ideas and you're worrying that you're not quite sure exactly what you're meant to be taking from any particular week, remember that in the iBooks at the beginning of the lecture material there is a summary of learning objectives. So if you feel like you have understood these for each week, you're doing pretty well. So this week I'll be talking about all 3 of these in the lecture today. The meaning of Enlightenment, which is obviously something that you will need to have an understanding of if you decide to answer the question on Enlightenment ideas and the French Revolution. How the Enlightenment challenged past ideas, and Enlightenment approaches to knowledge and truth, empiricism, rationalism and skepticism. I'm hoping that some of the things that I'm talking about will be revision. Things that you've encountered before in the course that I'll remind you of and put them in the context of Enlightenment ideas. And I'm hoping that we'll be able to kind of develop an interesting application of some of these arguments towards the end of the lecture today. Let's see how we go. So the lecture outline, what was the Enlightenment? First of all, I'll be talking about the context that we are discussing, the historical context of the Enlightenment, because as hopefully History of Ideas is teaching you, we really need to understand some of the intellectual, the social, the economic context in which ideas are found, because that really contributes to understanding what those ideas mean and understanding how they might have developed, why they might have developed, and what their significance was in the period. Then we'll look at some of the characteristics of the Enlightenment and focus as well on not just what the ideas might have been or what the values and debates might have been, but also how knowledge was done, which sounds a bit odd, but it's about how knowledge is thought of, how it's passed on, the kind of environment in which these ideas were taking place, which becomes very significant for the Enlightenment. If you came in a bit earlier, you just heard a little bit of Bach's Coffee Cantata. So this was a whole piece of music that Bach wrote about coffee. And you'll see the significance of that. Many people actually think the Enlightenment might not have taken place if it weren't for coffee. Coffee and cafes become very important as part of the secular culture. So we'll talk about that idea. And we'll talk about the idea of the philosophers who are the proponents of some of these Enlightenment ideas and values. Then I'll focus on a couple of particularly significant ideas in the Enlightenment, the impact or influence of the scientific revolution, always in scare quotes, scientific revolution, I should have put them on the slides, and also a deeper look at the idea of reason and debates and discussions about what reason was and how to apply it during this period. All right, context. We were talking about Enlightenment. One of the really central things in Enlightenment is the idea of challenging past ideas, challenging authority. And the two authorities we'll be looking at in particular are intellectual authorities and also the authority of kind of tradition. Now, the intellectual context that we're looking at, we can kind of link it to that idea of scholasticism. Do you remember what that is? Anyone remember scholasticism? If you're in my tutorials, I probably made you do some Aristotelian logic in class and pretend to be a monk. So scholasticism, this is this way of thinking about how to attain truth that grows up in the university systems of the Middle Ages. So scholastics would take some accepted authorities about matters of fact. What authorities were they? What sort of authoritative texts were they looking at? Yeah, so what's the text? The Bible, right? So they would take the Bible, and who else might they hold up as an authority, an intellectual authority? Greek philosopher starting with A. Aristotle, right? So they did really follow Aristotle. So they'd have Aristotle, they'd have the Bible, they'd have the writings of the church fathers, and they would try and interpret them and understand what they were saying about the questions that they had that were of interest. For example, is it okay to sell things for a profit? Is the earth eternal? And they would go about comparing those texts and try and make them consistent with one another. So hopefully this is reminding you a bit about that idea of scholastic inquiry and have debates. Very rarefied environment. You would have to be able to speak Latin, you would have to be quite educated, and already during the Renaissance you had the humanists kind of questioning the scholastic method. Another event that had occurred that was quite significant for the development of Enlightenment ideas is the 30 Years' War. We haven't really talked about this. We talked about the Reformation and the emergence of Protestantism, and there was an outcome of that was a treaty that was signed, the Peace of Augsburg, and the idea was that each separate sovereign nation could follow the religion of its ruler, whether that was, well, not any religion, Lutheranism or Catholicism. But that wasn't really upheld, and we ended up in this 30 Years' War, which originally started as a religious war. It was a war brought about by religious intolerance, by the idea that people were not free to follow what religion they wanted to, and in particular, some places in Europe and the Holy Roman Empire tried to force people to follow Catholic religion. And obviously there was people who were Protestants, did not like this, and it started this war which ended up lasting for 30 years. It didn't remain just a religious war. It became a war about territory and power, but it was one of the most destructive wars in history. Incredibly brutal and nasty as well. So not just was it a war, it was fought, a lot of the 30 Years' War was fought by mercenary soldiers. A mercenary is somebody who is paid to fight. And they were quite brutal, and there was a lot of slaughtering of people that were not really combatants in the war. So by the end of the 30 Years' War, not only did you have people that were killed in the war itself, but it precipitated plague and famine and other events. And by the end of the 30 Years' War, there was about a third of the population of Central Europe were dead. So this is a big event. And you can see how this is going to undermine a sense of trust or certainty in the church, whether that be Protestant or whether that be Catholic. This idea that this conflict had come out of a war of religion and a conflict about religious ideology had really undermined people's faith in the certainty of the intellectual system which had sustained them, the church. Another part of the context which hopefully is revision for you, Michael talked about witchcraft. And we're entering to the period, and you saw that delightful movie. Did you enjoy The Witch? They give you nightmares. It's actually a really good History of Ideas movie. Because that was kind of about this period of people settling in new territories and the fears and superstitions that were brought about by that. And in America, in Salem in particular, you had a lot of the witch trials, the famous witch trials. But so there's a great deal of superstition, and this is kind of evidenced by these major witch hunts that were occurring right up into the late Renaissance. And these ideas that people were actually gaining power and were agents of the devil. So this is the kind of thinking that had been going on. Another sort of part of the context here too, if we think about how people were punished, how they were treated for crimes. One of the most serious crimes you could commit was treason, undermining your sovereign, or in the case of this fellow, assassinating your sovereign. So treason could be punished using this punishment of being hanged, drawn and quartered. It's a way to really kill somebody, really, really, really kill them very dead and torture them along the way. It's a pretty brutal punishment. Most people, even people who think capital punishment might be okay in some circumstances, this is pretty barbaric. So in England, this was the punishment for anybody who rebelled against the king from 1241 to 1870, and some people were killed using this method of punishment for religious reasons as well during this period. So this poor guy here, this is Francois Ravaillac, and he assassinated Henry IV of France. And if we read this, it says, he was condemned to be tortured with red-hot pincers. His wounds were to be sprinkled with molten lead and boiling oil, and his body was then to be torn in pieces by 4 horses, the remains being subsequently burned. So you can see this guy, he's got his legs and his arms attached to 4 different horses, which are then sent off in opposite directions to tear him apart, and after that his remains are going to be burned. Brutal. These very kind of barbaric ways of treating people as well. And the prison system was really awful. So these are the kinds of social, political, intellectual context of the Enlightenment. Another really significant thing that was occurring, and you'll be talking about this in tutorials this week, the age of discovery. Well, for the Europeans, they were discovering things. I think the people who already lived in the countries they were discovering felt a bit differently. But it was certainly a time when there was a great interest in going and trying to find and colonise new territories. Partly this is motivated by economics. There are trade routes opening up. There's a lot of money to be made if you can establish these colonies or control various trade routes. And these new worlds, so-called new worlds that were being discovered by people during this period, were a huge source of fascination to the public, to the general public. So there's a lot of travel writing and travel books and fiction about imaginary new lands that are really popular during this period. It also has some effects on the way people see themselves and their place in the world. For a start, if you are encountering people who see the world very differently from you, maybe have a very different idea of God or religion, then this is going to kind of perhaps challenge your beliefs that you might hold, or that to see things in such a new light. It is also directly challenging some claims that were made by those authorities. Aristotle and St. Augustine were 2 people who had argued it would be impossible for anybody to live in the southern continents. They thought that they existed, the southern continents, but they didn't think that they would be populated for various reasons. And they have these kind of logical reasons why nobody could actually inhabit these countries. And then people are turning up to these countries and going, hey, here's some people. Here's my postcard of this guy I met down here. You're wrong. I have direct proof that these authorities were wrong. So this is another way in which these authorities are being challenged. So this is some of the kind of things that are going on, some of the context in which the Enlightenment is placed. Before I tell you about the Enlightenment, I have a question for you though. because we're now moving on to trying to define what the Enlightenment was. And I want you to define something for me first. What is a sandwich? So I've got a taker for bread, 2 pieces of bread. Beef or vegetables in between 2 pieces of bread. Anybody have a different idea, or anybody thinking, hang on, that doesn't fit my idea of a sandwich? Does it have to be bread? What else could it be? It just has to have the right structure. So would you be okay with, I think it's KFC or somewhere, have this double down burger thing or something where they have like a piece of chicken and then another piece of chicken and then stuff in the middle. Is that a sandwich? Sandwich? No. Yes? No? Does it have to have 2 pieces of bread? Have you heard of an open sandwich? Where you've got 1 piece of bread and then stuff on top. Is that a sandwich? Does it have to be savoury? So you were saying meat or vegetables. Can you have a sweet sandwich? Yes? Anyone's like, no, craziness. Very important question. This will be tested on the exam. No, it won't. But why am I asking you about sandwiches? Well, I'm kind of trying to make a point, and also I like sandwiches. I did not do this. I have other things to do with my time. But somebody has created this incredibly helpful chart to demonstrate the ways in which you might think about sandwiches. The sandwich alignment chart. According to where you sit in terms of how important you think the structure is, whether it has to be 2 separate pieces of things, whether it could be a bun that's kind of hinged, and what you can actually put inside the sandwich. And you can see we can go anywhere from the hardline traditionalist all the way to radical sandwich anarchy. And someone will defend that version of a sandwich. So too it is with the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment, like a sandwich, has many different ways of being defined. And you will find in your readings, people kind of might differ in when they say it starts and ends. I mean, this is kind of arbitrary, right? Picking a date and going, oh, it starts there and it ends there. So some people are very structured. I'm going to give you a kind of pretty structured version of the Enlightenment, but just be aware, like the sandwich, there are many ways of thinking about this. And when we're talking about Enlightenment ideas, I can't provide you with a checkbox where you say, oh, okay, if somebody is an Enlightenment person, they have to believe all of these things. It doesn't work like that. It's a bit like a sandwich. Sometimes you have meat, sometimes you don't. It's still a sandwich. The general Enlightenment sandwich is structured between 2 revolutions. The scientific revolution, in scare quotes, because we don't know if it's a revolution really, and the French Revolution. So if you're just trying to get a general feel for what people mean, this is a good way to start. But be aware, you can change these definitions, and you might need to do so in your essay. The Enlightenment sandwich is usually filled with things including reason, tolerance, freedom, the new science, and critical thought. I'll elaborate on those in a moment. The other thing that people often talk about with the Enlightenment is geographical location, because there are different kind of strands of Enlightenment that occur in different places. There's a Scottish Enlightenment, there's a German Enlightenment, there's a French Enlightenment, so there is a different character to the Enlightenment in these different places. An American Enlightenment. So depending where this is taking place, it might change as well. So really what it is there are different strands of related thinking and values and debate. Partly because one of the things that it prizes, or many people associate with the Enlightenment, is critical thought. This means that there's a lot of debate and a lot of disagreement. And even on matters of religion, some Enlightenment figures are very, very religious in a very traditional sense. Many of them very kind of religious, but in a non-traditional sense. Some of them are kind of bordering on maybe atheism, but you wouldn't say that during this period. Another thing about the Enlightenment, people are quite self-conscious about the fact that they are living through this time period. They are reflecting on the time period that they're in and saying, oh, hang on, this is kind of interesting. Can you see what's going on here? Unlike the Middle Ages or the Renaissance, which, as you found out, was not named that until later on. So generally, the Enlightenment ideas are a high value attached to reason, tolerance and freedom. Freedom we'll be picking up a bit more next week. We'll be talking a little bit more about reason this week. A criticism of old methods and institutions. And in particular, those kind of institutions include religious institutions and also, as I said, the institutions and traditions of politics and government. A belief in the new science, so the kind of ideas of science and the method of science coming out of the scientific revolution, and an optimism that pursuing that kind of way of seeking truth and understanding the world would benefit society, would be a good thing. And you might start thinking about what are your attitudes, for example, towards scientific progress. Do you think science is a way to make our lives better? Is this necessarily going to be the case? The Romantics disagreed with some of this. And also public debate. So we talked about how scholastics were kind of debating questions about how to make some of these texts consistent, like Aristotle and the Bible, and it had become very insular. They were kind of just talking to themselves. And the Enlightenment tends to be characterised by a much more open idea about knowledge and debate and trying to actually bring these questions and debates to a public realm. And free critical thought, not just accepting the past answers to questions, but actually trying to think for yourself. And a figure that you will be talking about in tutorials next week, Immanuel Kant, gave a very famous definition of enlightenment, not the only one, as you now know, but certainly one that's been very influential. And he talks about the enlightenment as bringing the light into the dark corners of the mind. What do you think he means by the dark corners of the mind? What do you think would be the dark corners? What would be a dark corner of your mind? Pardon? Yeah, things that maybe are not, or maybe that you haven't really subjected to inquiry, right? Maybe you've inherited a bunch of ideas or beliefs. Maybe you've been told things and you've just uncritically accepted it. Maybe you're superstitious, so you believe that witches can be in consort with the devil. Maybe you are prejudiced. Maybe you lack tolerance. So these are the kinds of things that he's talking about when he says the dark corners of the mind. And what is the light, do you think? Reason. Using your mind, your reason, to shine a light on those things and try and understand them and understand yourself better. I won't go into other things he said. He's quite an interesting thinker. You'll talk a bit more about some of his ideas in your tutorial. But he's really kind of voicing this idea that people should think for themselves, reject the traditional authorities that have told you what the truth is, and start to assume a responsibility for yourself to work out what to believe. So this is the kind of characterisation. Now, as I said, the way in which knowledge is pursued and the way in which ideas are kind of formulated and discussed and disseminated is also changing. The group most associated with the Enlightenment and Enlightenment ideas, proponents of Enlightenment ideas, are known as the philosophes. And that's just a French word for philosopher. But what it does distinguish, they're not talking about philosophers necessarily as people who are in universities who have studied philosophy. Philosophe is more like a public intellectual, somebody who is interested in ideas and debate, and in particular they are often people who really are interested in the pragmatic aspect of ideas, how you can apply ideas to make society better, to make people's lives better, to focus on really human problems, not just metaphysical issues to do with, the nature of the metaphysical universe or cosmology or the mind of God, but actually what's going to make a difference for people in society. And their success, and you'll notice this if you're doing the primary source readings for the Enlightenment question, you'll notice look at the kinds of sources that you're given. A lot of them are pamphlets, or they're not from a dense philosophical book. These are actually things that people are writing to try and spread the ideas and the knowledge. So people are writing novels, they're writing pamphlets, which are kind of very short things that you would print off and distribute. They're writing letters. There's a whole, we'll talk about in a second, a republic of letters. So they're trying to they're trying to spread these ideas as far as possible. They're not trying to lock themselves within a university and just discuss it with other people who are studying the same stuff as them. So if Enlightenment figures were around today, they would be blogging, they would be tweeting, they would be setting up Snapchat accounts. This is exactly the kind of thing that they want to do. Some examples that are helpful to have. Denis Diderot is a very famous example of a philosopher, and he is the author of one of the pieces that you might read if you're doing that essay question. He is a philosopher, he's a trained philosopher, he's also a writer more generally, and he is also the co-founder of one of the most important documents of the Enlightenment, the Encyclopedia. It's an encyclopedia. There had been encyclopedias before, but nothing like this. This was a real attempt to capture and publish human knowledge. It's like the Wikipedia of its day, right? You get lots of different people contributing, writing articles about anything from ideas and government to very practical things. For example, anatomy. This is an image showing somebody how to make a net. So it's very kind of technical kind of know-how, practical know-how as well. So this is the Encyclopédie ou Dictionnaire raison des sciences, des arts et des métiers par une société de gens de lettres. Totally accurate French right there. And so you have contributions from all of the major kind of philosophers that we'll be talking about, Voltaire and all of these other people. And it's not just, part of it is this idea of knowledge should be available widely. You might remember that one of the things that Michael suggested differentiated magic from science was the idea that magic was often he used the term esoteric. That idea, remember the alchemists. To be an alchemist you had to know all the secret symbols, right? You had to be in with the club. And this is the opposite of that. This is trying to make it as open and available as possible, to publish it, to distribute it, so that everybody can access this kind of knowledge. Another famous philosopher, so many people, if they're thinking of a philosophe, this is one of the probably most obvious, Voltaire. And he was born in France, but he had to leave France because of persecution, and he was locked up, his books were burned, and he found life in England a lot more free. He was a writer, historian, philosopher. He wrote copious amounts of things, and he wrote in lots of different ways. So he wrote novels, he wrote pamphlets, he wrote essays, he wrote letters, lots and lots of letters. He wrote about 20,000 letters. He also drank a lot of coffee. And reputedly, he drank about 40 to 50 cups of coffee a day. Admittedly, these were apparently kind of small, and they were a mix of coffee and chocolate, but still, look at him. Look at those eyes. He is buzzing and writing. And Voltaire is kind of the idea of his coffee intake and his letter writing also really kind of underlines a couple of things that were very important about knowledge and how it was spread. There is this real shift in culture to an idea of a public sphere, a secular public sphere. What do I mean by that? Well, where would you go if you wanted to catch up with some friends and have a chat about your Hoy essay, but not too much about your Hoy essay, just about how much you loved Hoy, but not actually sharing ideas too much about your Hoy essay? Where would you go? Huh? Trinity, yeah, right. You might hang out here. Well, this is a secular space. It's not quite public, although you probably wouldn't have to be a Trinity student. No one would really know if you snuck some of your non-Trinity friends in. But it is kind of it's a secular space, maybe not entirely public. Where else might you go? Yeah, cafe, right? You might catch up at a cafe. And this is exactly the kind of thing. So prior to this period, there were places, obviously, people caught up, and you might go to the market, but a lot of the kind of places of gathering were religious. So you would go to church, and that might be where you would socialise and meet people. And one of the big developments that occurs during this period is the discovery of coffee. Not really the discovery, other people had known about it, but it gets brought to Europe. And coffee has a couple of interesting things that help the Enlightenment. One is just the effects of caffeine. I don't know if Trinity students drink a lot of caffeine, but certainly if you've got a bit of a deadline or you have to stay awake, a bit of coffee, not a bad idea, or something caffeinated. What were people drinking before? No, not tea. Sometimes, yes. So, people would drink water, right? Boringly, yeah, they would drink water, but only if they could get access to clean, fresh drinking water, which not everybody could. The other thing, what alcoholic beverage do you think was the most consumed? Beer. So people drank a lot of beer. They drink it for breakfast sometimes. Will, if you know Will, he's very interesting to talk to about this. Apparently the beer was kind of a bit thick. It sort of had stuff in it. It was like a meal, right? And a bit weak. It wasn't super strong. But if you put alcohol, it kills off stuff. So it's actually often safer. It was sometimes safer than drinking water. So people would drink quite a lot of beer. That does not have the same effect on you as coffee. If anything, if you write a Hoy essay on beer, it's probably... one thing I think there was kind of an intellectual perk, right? But also you have cafes. And this is the first English coffee house, which is still there, built in 1650. And these kind of coffee houses popped up everywhere, and anybody could go. You had to pay 1 penny, so there was a small kind of fee. But anybody could go. It didn't matter whether you were educated or not, or where you were from. You could go to a coffee house, and you could have a conversation with people there. And it was a place where people would go and discuss ideas. And there would be people kind of calling out the news of the day, and people having debates about interesting stuff. And Voltaire might be there having a debate about freedom and toleration or whatever. So it was a great mixing kind of pot for people. And there were other versions of these kind of secular spaces, secular or semi-public spaces. There was a lot of informal societies, as in societies not run by the university or those kind of institutions. For example, the Lunar Society would meet in this place in Birmingham, and some of their this involved men from a number of different backgrounds, including, you might have heard of James Watt, who was responsible for really improving the steam engine, which becomes incredibly important for the Industrial Revolution. So you would have engineers and philosophers and other people meeting up in these informal societies. Also really important, salons, the idea of a salon. And this would be somebody wealthy would run a salon where they would open their house up and people would come and discuss maybe a novel or literature, or they might discuss a scientific paper, or they might discuss political ideas. And these were also spaces where women could often become educated or have their work accepted or read and debated, because women are still not really in the formal education system. But if you're a wealthy woman, you might become a salonier, you might run a salon and have famous intellectuals come and discuss things, and you would be able to take part in these discussions. Freemasonry also develops during this period. There's a bit more on that in the iBook if you're interested in the Freemasons. And people like Voltaire and others, including Benjamin Franklin in America and a lot of other philosophers, actually set up what they call a republic of letters. And I particularly like this image because it reminds me of something. It reminds me of the internet. And the Republic of Letters was kind of like a really slow internet. So people would write, you'd have an idea or something you wanted to debate, and you would write something and send it to somebody somewhere else in the world, maybe in America or somewhere else in Europe. And this group of, and they were men, they were pretty much all men in the Republic of Letters, but they would converse with each other via this medium. And the Republic of Letters you'll see mention of in some of your other readings. So that was kind of some of the social changes or the social ways in which ideas were kind of discussed and spread, and the way people accessed knowledge during this period. So we're just going to have a closer look now at a couple of ideas in particular that become very important to these people. And one is the new science. So I said before that the sandwich bread of the Enlightenment was the French Revolution and the Scientific Revolution. One of the reasons that people tend to kind of begin the Enlightenment at the kind of end of the Scientific Revolution is because of how impactful that way of looking at and understanding the world was for these thinkers. What do you remember about the Scientific Revolution? What were the important things that occurred? What changes took place? Why was it significant, or why was what some people call the revolution significant? Yeah, so what is science, right? Because they still weren't really talking in terms of science during the Scientific Revolution. What is science? Sorry? Yeah, so it's a method, right? So you can think about the scientific method. This is one really important thing. The idea that how do we go about finding out truth? Well, we might have to conduct experiments and use observations to try and find out the truth. So this is one really important part of the scientific revolution. What else? Anything else that you can remember? A couple of things just to jog your memories. So to the extent that it was a revolution, and as Michael has said, there is a bit of debate about idea, probably the thing that is revolutionary is at the beginning of that period, people largely believe Aristotle's ideas of the physical world, of the cosmos and the physical world. The four causes, the ideas of motion being inherent in objects, the idea of a geocentric world, so a geocentric universe with the Earth in the middle. At the end of this period, pretty much all of them have been thrown out. So his version of physics had lasted that long, from the kind of ancient Greek world right up to the Middle Ages. And by the end of this period, obviously some people are still believing it, but for the most part these have been rejected. This idea of searching for universal laws of nature, fundamental laws through which we can explain and predict and possibly even control the natural world. These really very powerful explanations saying, well, okay, we might have knowledge about these little bits and pieces, but if we have a universal law, we can say things about everything. A good one to have in mind here is gravity, right? The universal law. It doesn't just apply to this lecture theatre, it doesn't just even apply to this earth. It's a universal law, a fundamental law, based on observation, experiment and reason. And also, and this one's a little different perhaps from the others, a very strong belief that scientific progress is for the betterment of humanity. This is a different kind of claim, right? This is a kind of value claim, saying this is good. Do you believe that? Yes? No? Do most people think science is a force for good? Maybe you do. You might think about where we're going with things like AI. Is that always going to be a good thing? Maybe, maybe not. But this is definitely part of this. And we have people like Copernicus who really not the only person who's ever done this, but certainly a very significant person challenging the geocentric view. Galileo, whose observations directly contradict some of the claims made by Aristotle. Francis Bacon, when we're talking about scientific method, he's one of the core people who developed this scientific method, and a very optimistic person to say science is something that will help us progress. Newton, really solidifying a lot of the findings of this period and writing these very precise mathematical laws. And these ideas have a great influence during this period, beyond just the idea of the physical world. Because one thing it does is these ideas are successful, right? It seems to work. They seem to be discovering true things. And they've been doing it not by reading the Bible and Aristotle, but by actually figuring things out for themselves and using observation and experiment. So this induces a great confidence in the ability of the human mind to find things out, find out the truths of the world. It undermines further the intellectual authority of the church, because obviously a lot of these things are directly contradicting claims that are made in the Bible. Remembering at this time, religion is definitely not dead. People are very religious. There is a lot of the philosophers adopt an idea of religion known as deism, and this is the idea that God creates the universe like a really complicated machine, and then kind of goes, bye, and walks off, right? So a deist would say God is present as the creator, but God does not intervene in people's daily lives. But religion is still very much on the scene. There is a great interest in the practical applications of the discoveries of the new science, and an attempt to actually take that way of understanding the world and that method of finding truth and applying it to other areas. And by other areas I mean not just constraining it to the physical world, but looking to other human problems and human issues and other areas of interest to humanity, and trying to replicate the success of people like Galileo, Newton in particular, in other areas. And this becomes quite a theme. So people start to want to be, I want to be the Newton of the, and I'll give you some examples in a minute that you can try and work out what that might mean. And this science becomes very popular, not just for the intellectuals, but more widely. So you have, this is there's a couple of paintings by this artist of this period depicting the same kind of thing. So, you know, you're in your expensive manor house in the country, and there's no Netflix, there's no, I keep forgetting the name, I don't know why I've got a block in my mind. What's the game everyone's playing at the moment where you kill each other? Yeah, so the game where you have to stalk and kill your friends. You can't do that. What else are you going to do with your life if you can't go and kill your friends in virtual reality? Well, you might invite a travelling philosopher or scientist to come to your house and set up an experiment and explain some scientific ideas to you. And that's what people did. So you would have these people that would travel around, and this person has an orrery, so they're showing people the ideas about the solar system that are being developed and explaining how it all works. Other people might have bought an air pump and demonstrated how that works. So you have this very popular idea of science that becomes very popular beyond just people who are university educated. It also opens up possibilities for women. I'll just talk to you briefly about, so there's a few more of these in the iBook as well. In particular, a lot of people became kind of hobbyists with astronomy, because you can actually do quite a bit of astronomy from your own house, right? If you've got the right equipment, if you've got a good telescope and you have a bit of mathematical training, you can actually do quite a lot. And this is what people would do. They would buy or make for themselves astronomical equipment, and they would make their own kind of studies of the heavens. And there are a lot of women who are interested in doing this. And in fact, it was kind of seen as an okay thing for a woman to do, because a lot of astronomy is quite tedious. there's a lot of like observing things, writing down exact locations and times and note-taking. And this was kind of seen as, oh, those women with their little brains, they can kind of deal with that. And a lot of women actually got into astronomy, and there are also some really nice stories documenting how women who were interested in science would kind of marry men for their telescopes. So there's some women who kind of went, yeah, okay, you might be old and ugly, but you've got a really good telescope. So I'm going to marry you so I can like do some astronomy. And you have some women who actually, most of them during the time would not have been recorded as such. Some of them were. Caroline Herschel's a nice example. It was her brother who was actually, she would help. And she discovered several comets. She was the first woman, she was actually ended up being paid for her contributions to science, which was unusual for the time. But you do have a lot of descriptions of women kind of accessing education through the domestic sphere. And there's other versions too. So just to kind of see how you're going with that idea, because it is a significant one, here is 4 kind of ideas. I want you to talk just for a couple of minutes amongst yourselves, and if you need to go and have a bathroom break or have a drink of water, go and do that too. Which of the following do you think might be an example of this idea of taking the methods and the goals of the new science, taking them from the world of physics and applying them and extending them to some other area during the Enlightenment? So have a chat amongst yourselves, only a couple of minutes because I have to give up 10 minutes at the end to IT. So just a couple of minutes. If you need to have a bathroom break, do it now. A couple of minutes discussion, and then we'll come back in a few minutes.
We're often talking about the educated people's ideas, whereas, there's obviously still a lot of superstition and that kind of thing. I don't think that witchcraft was such an issue, but you start to see, obviously, this is not a feminist era, right? And so those ideas really don't take up till much later on in the piece. I mean, they have their grounds here. You have people like Mary Wollstonecraft who start taking, and we'll see this a bit next week, ideas about equality and liberty and saying, well, hang on, these apply to women as well. But it's not like suddenly everyone goes, oh yeah, great, yeah, let's adopt this. So societies are very slow to change. And I think, when I mentioned about astronomy being seen as kind of, well, it's okay people to do that, there's still a very clear idea of what is appropriate for women and what is not. They are still seen as inferior and intellectually inferior. And when you start seeing, as we'll get later on, Jane will be giving a lecture on feminism, and certainly in the early days of that, it was so prevalent, the idea that women just were not intellectually on the same level as men and weren't capable. So that idea is definitely still around, and it's an exception rather than a rule. When you have women who are educated, there's not a lot of them. So it's still not something that you don't go and get a formal education. But this is why it's interesting, because the society allowed, you would still have to be very wealthy and you would have to be very keen, but there were avenues through kind of your domestic life where you might be able to pursue that kind of stuff.
What about the role of heresy and other education?
No, it's still, people still talk about heresy. It's never really gone away in a way. And I think, religion, we're downplaying it a bit this week, although you'll see when we start looking at ideas of reason. No one is openly an atheist. They're just not. I mean, Hume, who we talked about at the end, is suspected of atheism, and this is seen as one of the reasons why he might not ever get to secure academic position, because you have to be religious, so you kind of not really have a choice. So that when we're absolutely, and a lot of Enlightenment people aren't arguing against religion. Some of them are arguing against the institutions of organised religion, and they're arguing against religious intolerance. But they're not really attacking the belief, not the belief, no. They might attack and they would attack like the authority of the Bible, but they're not turning around and attacking the belief system. And as I said, a lot of them it's a complex story, so a lot of them adopt this idea of deism, which is pretty radical for that period. And they're kind of open, they're much more open to different ways of understanding belief. I'm sure people were atheists, but it still was not something they would openly know. Yeah. So the church has still got quite a lot of power. I don't think I might be wrong, but yeah, it's certainly not the heyday of that time.
Maybe it's less in like the but it's still the belief still there in the
Yeah, absolutely.
but education is less.
Yeah, absolutely. And with all of these things, right, there's always, we're always telling the story of people who wrote their ideas down rather than other people. But and in France, the religion was, and as we see with the French Revolution, one of the things that was they really did attack religious institutions. But France was very religious, and a lot of the clergy and the parish priests got involved in the revolution, so they were kind of revolutionary people themselves. But yeah, it's still absolutely around. It's just not as and it's not quite as directing of these kind of debates. Yeah.
Okay. Shh. Sorry, that was a brief break. I promise I'll give you longer breaks in other lectures, but we don't have so much time this time. How did you go? What did you think might be the answer? Which of these do you think is an example of someone trying to harness the ideas of the new science and apply them to a new area? Anyone want to hazard a guess? I'll tell you it's not D. Okay, it's not Rococo art. B, why B? Why are you saying A? Okay, why A? A is wrong, by the way. Only reason A is wrong is it's exactly an example of science within the physical world. So it's a very good example of exactly what we mean by, if we're talking about trying to find universal laws, using mathematical modelling. That's a great example of that, but it's not an example of extending it to another area. Yep. C, we've got to take it for C. Anybody else think C? You're also wrong, but you're wrong in a right way. C, because C is actually a pretty good C is a good guess, because C is an example of somebody trying to make a science of something else, right? It's Freud trying to make a science of the mind. And it's an excellent example of an extension of scientific principles. Successful? Not so much, but it's definitely an attempt to, based on observation and evidence, he tries to create fundamental universal laws about what governs people's unconscious in particular. So it's an excellent example of that. It's just the timing's wrong, because he's not an Enlightenment person. He's later on. So we're left with B, right? B, the economic law of supply and demand. So this is a good example of an attempt to apply scientific principles into a non-scientific sphere. And if you're going on to do economics or accountancy even, you might really be interested in this kind of as a history of ideas. The father of economic liberalism, and we may be talking about him later in tutorials, Adam Smith, Scottish Enlightenment. And he is exactly doing this. He's saying, you know, I want to be the Newton of economics. I want to do for economic theory, or do for economics, what Newton did for physics. I want to take all of this data about economic behaviours, like what people buy, what people charge for things, how much people get paid for their work, when people open factories, and I want to create universal kind of laws and fundamental principles to explain this seemingly messy kind of system. And Smith is addressing, and this is a very Enlightenment thing too, because of course this is very central to human life, and it's a very human problem. The problems of economics are to do with how should we distribute scarce resources? How should we decide who gets what jobs, who gets what stuff? And Smith's idea, based in observation, was that the best way to distribute resources was to allow the market to do it, to not intervene. So he said the best way for you to decide how much to charge for a pair of shoes or a coffee is just to charge as much as you want for your pair of shoes or your coffee and see what people will buy it for. And you just let all of these individuals make all of these decisions based entirely on their own self-interest. And you don't have the government intervene. You don't have the government going, oh, this is terrible, people shouldn't pay so much for shoes, let's make everybody sell the shoes at a different price. No, you leave that to individuals making their own self-interested decisions about how much they'll pay, how much they'll work for, and then you just let the market decide. And this is the idea of the invisible hand. This is quite, and here, once you start hearing this and you line it up with Newton, you can kind of see it going on, right? Gravity is invisible, right? Gravity is this invisible force that he uses to explain these things that occur in the physical world. And this is what Smith is making predictions about what will happen in the economic world if you allow the market to determine price and quantity. And he says this will actually end up coalescing on the best possible outcome in terms of, and he talks of it in terms of consumer and producer surplus is the way in economics it's decided, but basically it's the common interest. It will be the best for everybody if you just let the market determine these ideas. And that's his kind of law, right? This is not really science though. Economics is not really science, not in the way that physics is science. It's often called, like psychology is also not really science at the moment anyway. People are still trying to find a science of psychology. We haven't got one. We don't really know what minds are. It's a bit of a problem. And many other people are also trying to be a Newton of the mind. So many people that we'll be looking at next who are interested in psychology and reasoning are trying to apply these kind of principles there as well. All right. Okay, we're going to see... Oh, we've got about 20 minutes. Let's see how we go. Now we're going to focus a bit more on that slippery idea of reason, which is one of the very central ideas of Enlightenment thinking. Remember I said a high value attached to reason, the use of the human mind to discover things about the world. But this ends up presenting a lot of problems and difficulties and issues, some of which Michael talked about in the last lecture you had. How do we find things out? How do we gain knowledge? Where does knowledge come from? Are we born with knowledge? Is it possible for us to ever have certain knowledge of anything? These questions had always been around, right? We talked about them with the ancient Greeks. But they have a new urgency now. Because what had been happening? You've been questioning the authorities that have told you the answers to these questions, and you've proven them wrong in many cases. Well, how do you know that your new theories are any better? If those people were wrong, how do you know you're not wrong as well? So there is this kind of questions really bubble to the surface. How can we know? And there are a lot of implications for the answers that are given. Now, I'm hoping this section will be revision, so we'll see how we go. And this is just a quick quote. This demonstrates, I think, an attitude towards knowledge. Pierre Bayle, a skeptic of the period, he says, the antiquity and general acceptance of an opinion is not an assurance of its truth. Well, what is an assurance of its truth then? How can we become assured of truth? And you might remember this distinction between rationalism and empiricism. Is this ringing a bell? Yes, a little bit. Rationalism. And this part of the lecture, don't worry if you're not following everything going on. Just kind of let it wash over you a little bit. Try and take something from it. Rationalism is the idea that our knowledge and our concepts are important in important ways independent of our sense experiences. And your ancient rationalist friend is Plato. Remember, that's why he's pointing up. He's saying this is just a mess, right? This is going to lead you astray. If you want to know the truth, in fact, you need to just try and purely use your mind. Don't rely on what the world is like. The world is kind of messy and leading you astray. Empiricism. And I've set them up as opposite ends, but not everybody is going to be on one of these ends. But empiricism is the claim that all our concepts and knowledge of the world are ultimately derived from our sense experiences. From touching, seeing, hearing, measuring, observing. And in the ancient Greeks, probably the closest to this was Aristotle. Doesn't mean that you can't use your reason in some ways, but really the basis of your knowledge is the world itself. And that's why in that picture Aristotle was going like this. No, here, right down here. Do you remember your rationalist that Michael talked about? Yep, Descartes. Now, he is not an Enlightenment figure. He's earlier, but he's kind of the purest expression of this kind of rationalist thinking. That so in the Enlightenment you do have rationalists and you have empiricists, but for various reasons empiricism becomes much more dominant and important. But rationalists like Descartes, he poses this kind of problem. Here's how you might think like a rationalist, how you might reach a kind of conclusion that our knowledge has to come from our minds and not from our senses. Do you remember this? So Descartes is saying, well, if you want to find out if you know something, how can you tell if you know something for sure, absolute certainty? Are you certain? Do you know that you're in the Hoy Theatre? You're all looking at me going, it's a trick. Right, but if somebody just casually asked you that, not in a lecture when you're talking about rationalism, you kind of go, yeah, I'm in the Hoy Theatre, what? Yeah, that's something I know. I know I'm in the Hoy Theatre. Do you know 2 + 2 = 4? Yeah, right, that's stuff you know. And you can put everything that you know into, just think of everything that you know. Now, go. On the count of 3, think of everything you know. 3, 2, 1. All the things you know. There they are. Now, how do you really know that you know them for certain? And Descartes says, well, what you need to do is subject them to the strongest possible test. And that is it possible for you to doubt it? Is it possible for you to doubt that you are here now? Try. Is it possible for you can you entertain any doubt that you're not in this room? If you can't, you're not being imaginative enough. You could be dreaming, couldn't you? It would be a rubbish dream, but you could be dreaming it. You could be hallucinating. Maybe we've dosed the water with LSD and you're having a trip and this is a really boring trip that you're having. We know our senses, and he basically says, well, our senses, because how do you know? What evidence are you using? You're using sensory evidence, aren't you? You're going, well, I feel like I'm here. I can see the lecture thing. A lot of what you're relying on is the evidence from your senses. But Descartes says that's wrong all the time, right? We know that our senses lead us astray. There are optical illusions set up based on this kind of thing. Our senses are wrong all the time. And we also dream things. And in our dreams, we don't know that we're dreaming. So yes, it's possible for you to doubt that. And in fact, it's possible for you to doubt everything based on your senses. So if in your head you have any piece of knowledge that you think you are certain of, and it comes from sensory experience, throw it away. Now we are left with things like 2 + 2 = 4. Well, arguably, that's not based on sensory experience. What about all bachelors are unmarried? Not based on sensory experience, right? It's kind of just a definitional thing. Aha! But what if I had snuck around and implanted all of you with a special chip in your brain that made you think wrong things? Can you be certain that hasn't happened? No, you cannot. And Descartes' version of this was an evil demon. He said, well, what if there's an evil demon? It has all this power and it's making you believe things like 2 + 2 = 4, and it's not true. It's possible to doubt that. So that is also not certain. What are we left with? Does anyone remember? What is the only claim that Descartes allows we can have certain knowledge of? The only thing he thinks we have left is this. I think, therefore I am. He says the only thing that you cannot doubt is that you are thinking. Because it's kind of self-contradictory. You can't think that it's wrong that you're thinking. Okay, so he says that's it. There you go. That's the only thing left. I think, therefore I am. And not only that, but you can't even know that you are something with a body. All you can know is that you have a mind. I am a thinking thing distinct from matter. Nothing else can be certain. But Descartes doesn't leave it there, no. Does Descartes wallow in self-doubt for the rest of his life? No. How does he get out of this problem? Does anyone remember? You know how I talked about an evil demon? And you had a question about religion. He's very religious. Most people are, right, in this period. And if you're very religious and you believe in God, is God going to deceive you? No. Not according to Descartes. So he says, all those things like 2 + 2 = 4 and all bachelors are unmarried, you're fine with them. Because God's not an evil demon. God's lovely and nice, and God wouldn't do that to you. So you can have all of that stuff back as certain knowledge. You don't get your sensory stuff back, but you get all of those ideas back. What he calls clear and distinct ideas, and he has a definition of that. But of course this is a problem if you don't agree with Descartes that you can wheel God in at the last minute to solve this problem. And this is still, people still talk about this. How can we get out of this sceptical problem? The other side of the equation, I'm going to have to be quick. They're going to be coming, the IT people are coming. John Locke, empiricism, tabula rasa. You are born a blank slate. You have nothing in that little mind of yours at all until you experience things. And all of your knowledge of the world comes from those experiences. And I will take this up again next week because there are very important social and political consequences of believing in empiricism. Also during this period, note that one of the other reasons empiricism is significant is because it underlies much of science. If you are basing your ideas of the world on observation and experiment, you are using empirical knowledge. So, and I'll pick this up next week, the consequences of this in terms of political and social ideas. So just put a little placeholder there because we'll come back to this. The last thing I want to go through, and I will try to get this argument, and this is where you don't have to follow all of this argument, but I love this. This is one of my favourite philosophical arguments of all time. And I particularly like it because this is an argument due to an Enlightenment figure and it has profound consequences for our way of seeing the world even today. And this is due to David Hume. And he does not shy away from the consequences of his reasoning. He says, you're all cowards. Bringing in God at the last minute to solve that problem, have the courage of your convictions. And he has many arguments about why The things we think we must know, we do not have any rational reason for believing. And there's a number of these arguments attacking different kinds of knowledge. I'm going to discuss briefly, and as I said, don't worry if you don't follow all of this. It's in the iBook a bit as well, but I think it's a fascinating argument, partly because he is an Enlightenment figure arguing against the possibility of actually discovering things through reason. This is his argument, and his argument is against induction. Induction is at the heart of science. Induction is the move you make whenever you go from making a lot of observations about what's happened in the past to generalising, for example, via a universal law of nature, to what will happen in the future. For example, do you think that tomorrow gravity will still hold you on the Earth? So if you come here tomorrow, are you all going to be floating around? No. Do you feel like you know that? What about the sun? The sun's going to rise tomorrow, right? Okay, well, how do we know these things? And Hume said, well, we have to really subject these to rational inquiry. But notice this particular pattern of reasoning, induction, reasoning from observed things to an unobserved future or unobserved entities, rests on a particular assumption. And this is the assumption that nature is uniform. Here, uniform means same. It rests on the assumption that the way things have occurred in the past, for example, gravity, will occur in the future. And that is a piece of knowledge we need to think about whether we know. Do we know nature is uniform? How can we know whether nature is uniform? And here is what he says about that. He says, well, there are two ways of reasoning, of coming to knowledge. Follow with me as best you can. One, I have told you, right? If I say to you, all bachelors are unmarried, that's kind of a definitionally true thing, right? It would be a contradiction if I said, oh, I found this bachelor but they're married, so I've proved you wrong. You just go, no, you just don't understand the word bachelor. By definition, a bachelor is unmarried. It's contradictory. It's what Hume would call a relationship of ideas. You can't, it's just contradictory to think any other way. So we might use that to prove the uniformity of nature. But it doesn't work, because it turns out that there is nothing self-contradictory about me saying gravity won't work tomorrow. It would be weird, but it's not a contradiction. It would be weird if the sun didn't rise tomorrow. It would be weird if everything changed, but it wouldn't be a contradiction. It's not a logical impossibility. It's like science fiction, but that's not logically impossible. I could write a book about it, right? The day gravity stopped working, perfectly coherent book. So we cannot prove the uniformity of nature by appealing to this idea that it is somehow like a definitional thing. It just has to be the case that nature is uniform. We have to throw that definition away. Well, we're only left with one other possibility, and you might spot why this is bad news. Because the only other way to defend this claim is by appealing to induction. And an inductive argument would say, don't worry, tomorrow gravity will work because the future will resemble the past. Hang on. That contains the assumption of the uniformity of nature within it. That is what you call a circular argument, where you are already assuming the thing that you're setting out to prove. Another famous circular argument: we know that the Bible is the Word of God because the Bible tells us that it was written by God, and God always tells the truth. Circular. And this is the same thing. We're depending on the thing we're trying to prove. It doesn't work. So where are we left then? If all of the claims that are based on induction, all of the claims that are based on, and for Hume this is pretty broad, right? Because he thinks anything to do with causality is based on this. Because we never see cause, we just see one thing happening and then another thing happening, and we kind of infer there's this thing that's linking them called cause, and that whatever one thing happens and it reliably produces the other thing, that's going to keep going on. That turns out to be most of science. Induction is a very powerful form of reasoning that's used everywhere, and Hume has basically kind of said you can't generate, you actually rationally don't know those things. You have no rational reason for believing gravity will work tomorrow. You have no rational reason for believing the sun will rise tomorrow. What he ends up saying is, it's just kind of a habit of thought. It's a psychological quirk. That's what humans do. They think that stuff. It doesn't make it rational. It doesn't make it reasonable. And he basically says, I am ready to reject all belief and reasoning and can look upon no opinion even as more probable or likely than another. And he eventually says, reason is and ought to only to be the slave of the passions and can never pretend to any other office than to serve and obey them. Basically, you are motivated by emotion, and your rationality is just about fulfilling those things. You cannot kind of rationally decide and choose and judge. The reason I wanted to present Hume, doesn't matter if you didn't follow all of that. The point is, we have this person in the heart of the Enlightenment who is basically saying nothing pretty much that we do or think, actually we have a rational reason for doing so. So he's incredibly pessimistic in one sense about reason, at the point where people are meant to be very optimistic about reason and progress. Okay, I'm going to have to hand you over to IT now, and I would like you to pay attention to what they're saying. If you are among the group of people who can leave, they'll tell you if you're able to leave without doing these things. You may go very quietly. Please be as quiet as you can, because they'll be explaining things to other people. I'm about to try and open up the lecture quiz. I'll just quickly display the image while IT come in to set up, and see if I can do this where, no, I can never do it right. Okay, .cam. Hopefully it's all fine. Just turn that off. I know, it's all right.
Thank you very much for your help. Maybe we should.
Might have to switching inputs. Yeah, there we go. Right.
This one?
There we go. It's not. It hasn't been right since power. Try going the other way. Can we get both to go?
Computer. Sorry, we're still trying. It's just not
This is not cooperating.
cooperating.
The volume has been weird today. I've got the volume to work on one lecture and none of the other one.
We found the mutes embedded.
Oh,
There we go.
yeah, right.
Here we go.
There you go. Here's the open.
So that's just to the left, so project to the right, and go
Yeah, that'll do.
on there.
And project to right and switch over there.
Skip out of that. On that. Try to airplane. All right, so you guys note this quiz number down? I've got this number. I'm going to have to take this one off in a second, so do note it down. I just So right was computer, wasn't it? No. Was right on laptop then. Right, I'm just going to go to airplane so I can just get this procedure up. Okay. All right. Thank you very much. Okay, so we've got a little bit of housekeeping on your iPads to do, and it is for everyone that came in August last year. So if you joined Trinity College in August, then you need to stay and we need to do some steps on your iPad. If you came in Feb, then this step doesn't relate to you, so you can quietly exit. So it's only we need to do this if you came in August last year. All right, we'll just give everyone a little minute to leave. Please stay if you came in August. We have to do some steps on your iPad, so grab your iPad out. All right, we're nearly ready. Okay, now everyone's nearly gone who's need to go, so we'll get cracking. All right. I'm going to read some instructions and we're going to show a video. So we'll show some instructions on one screen and a looping video of what you'll need to do on the other as well. So you need to open your iPad and go to Settings, General, and then Profile Management. So that's what's happening on this one. General, down the bottom, Profile, and we need to select that profile. You should only see one profile, and we're about to delete it. So you need to select the profile and then choose Remove Profile. Then you'll be asked to enter your passcode and remove once more. So we'll just wait there and we'll do that step. So the idea is we're going to remove the old profile that pointed to the old email, and we're going to get you a new profile that will point to Office 365. Okay, so we'll just doing that again. We've removed the profile. Now, some of you might fall off the Wi-Fi when we do this. If you did fall off Edgerome, if you've suddenly lost your Wi-Fi signal, you'll need to go back to choose Edgerome and pop in your username and password, just as we've got on the screen there. So remember the format is username@trinity.edu.au. So that's probably a third of you might drop off the Wi-Fi. It's a bit hard for me to say, but just join again and we'll give you a moment to do that if you have fallen off the Wi-Fi. All right. Don't see many people typing, so maybe it's been really good. So the next step, once you've reconnected into our network, is to go to Safari and type in this web address here, tcgo.io. So what we're going to go do is go back to our little page that will let you download your profile again, and this time this profile will know about Office 365. So you put in your username and your password, just your straight username, you don't have to put in the long one, and your password, and then you will get a link that comes up after you log in, and please choose Download Now. Downloading now will ask you a bunch of questions, so you need to hit the allow, install, you enter your passcode, you hit install a couple more times as it's showing on the video, and